we have now settled in for the very final session of the Hyderabad Literary Festival 2017. The 7th edition, and the last 3 days have been a whirlwind. You would agree, I suppose, but we definitely felt so. When we began, we had a list of 100 events that we had on offer here over the 3 days, and we are now at the 100th event. Of course, I'm using it metaphorically, but yes, close to 100 events is what we had. I think a round of applause also for the audience who has been here absolutely, through sun and some more sun. And very happy to have you on this final plenary. I'm also very excited that for a change, we have an all-women panel here. Of course, there are many women that have been on the panel. But yes, this has been quite deliberate. We are here to deliberate on, I think, women in the creative fields. I do have, and we've done this alphabetically, so we have Arundhathi Subramaniam, who you saw on stage just now. We have Katharina Kakar, and I have Tishani Doshi on the other side of me. These three ladies are individuals, strong individuals, and have made a very definite and distinct mark in their fields. Their statement as creators, as artists, as writers is well known, and they have created a niche and more in their own fields. And I will briefly, of course, Arundhathi has been talked about a few minutes ago over here, but I would like to, in this context, mention again that she is the award-winning poet and artist, an eminent writer on spirituality and culture. Over the years, she has worked as a poetry editor and curator, and as a journalist on literature, classical dance, and theatre. Thank you, Arundhathi, for agreeing to be part of this panel. Katharina Kakar is an anthropologist, somebody who's done comparative religion at the Free University of Berlin. And she presently resides in Goa, is a practicing artist. She has put up her exhibition installation that has been here, and to great response, I believe, over the last 3 days. She was at the Goethe-Zentrum prior to that. She practices art, she writes, and of course has a very significant space with young children, where she used the creative form as a means of therapy under her NGO, the Tara Trust, which is in Goa. And this is the group of marginalized children that she works with. Tishani Doshi is a writer, an accidental dancer. We had a session with her just an hour or two ago. An Indian poet, journalist, and based in Chennai. Also has several books to her credit in poetry and fiction. Her literary reviews have taken her to various places in the world, and great exciting reviews that she brings out on a weekly basis. So we have here three ladies, and my question at this, I would say, somewhat interesting topic of Not Just the Menstruating Muse is to each one, and I'll go alphabetical, is to talk about your journey, your personal journey, in the context of creating that space in your fields, and has that been an issue as a woman, as an individual? And may I hand over the mic to Arundhathi.
I'm not sure whether it's a good thing to have one's name start with an A in this case, but has this been an issue? Let me say the reason I agreed to be on this panel was because it seemed to be a panel that was interested in exploring the notion of gender and what it means to be a woman, none of which I'm squeamish about. I know there are some of my fellow women artists who can sometimes be uncomfortable with the term woman writer or woman artist. And my own response to that is that I'm not uncomfortable about it, as long as it's not a capital letter identity, as long as it's a lowercase identity. And there are times when I've enjoyed the epithet, and I've found that it's been a tool for self-understanding. It's been an implement that's helped me to know myself better. It's been an implement that's helped me to free myself in some ways. I found it a wonderful way of questioning the many ways in which gender is constructed. So to that end, I'm not squeamish about the idea of being identified as a woman artist. But is that the only identity? Is that the one that I want to, is that the one that I would habitually assign to myself? No. In fact, if it means some kind of club membership, no. But as long as it means constituency and not ghetto, yes. How has it affected me? In innumerable ways, I'm sure. There are times when it's very consciously been a part of my poetry. And there are times when it's perhaps been less conscious. And either way, that's fine for me. It's just that I'm also aware of the fact that while some of these freedoms are relatively new for women still, just to be able to express ourselves in certain ways in poetry is new. There was a time at which we didn't even know that women were writing poetry, or we weren't hearing it. There weren't listeners for it. So just to know that it's possible is a relatively recent freedom. I'm aware of that. And I'm not in a hurry to throw that away. But I would say this, that while things are considerably perhaps better than they were for generations before us, it's not progress with a capital P, but things have certainly changed and improved, and we are heard in ways that were perhaps in less embattled ways than before. I think there are all sorts of subtle ways that endure, subtle ways in which I'm aware of the fact that as a woman writer, I've had to negotiate certain spaces that haven't always been immediately open or welcoming. I think there are ways in which one negotiates structures of entitlement, old boys networks, cronyism of various kinds. But perhaps we can return to that later. I'm not sure I should be hogging the space.
You can. In fact, I remember in one of your articles you talked about silencing strategies. And I thought that was quite interesting. So yes, you should. Do please go ahead. We'll come to both Katharina and Tishani.
The silencing strategies, I think, that I mentioned in that particular article were of different kinds. I think one is sometimes aware of unequivocal silencing strategies, unsubtle, blatant. It's straightforward browbeating. So for instance, when Kuti Revati, the Tamil poet, finds that her poem Breasts suddenly provokes a furor that eventually impels her to leave her home and move elsewhere, I think that's one kind of obvious silencing strategy. But there are others which are more subtle. And I think perhaps the most insidious is trivialization. The many ways in which one can be damned with faint praise, the many ways in which one can encounter, as I said earlier, entitlement, and find that it's not easy to penetrate certain spaces unless you agree to play particular roles that have been assigned to you already, which is acolyte, groupie. So when you don't play those roles and still have to find a way to make yourself heard, without raising your voice, because the art of poetry, to me, still remains the art of the murmur, the art of the whispered voice. To find and negotiate ways to do that is an ongoing process. And it's also a process of illumination, it's also a journey of growth, so I'm not entirely unhappy about that. The other thing that I would say, along with the trivialization part of it, is the many ways that we just don't talk about, and I think very often even women don't talk about with each other. The many ways in which, and that was my pet peeve, I think, in the article that you're alluding to, Amita. When a woman artist, for instance, a woman writer, chooses to use the first person singular, the I, for example, the immediate response is that this is private, sentimental, unexamined biography, personal biography, it's autobiography. Often this is a woman talking about her own neurotic, unfulfilled life. Whereas when male writers very often use the first person singular, they are immediately talking about the collapse of socialism, the end of innocence in post-industrial India, whatever. You know, they're talking about grand themes. But it's very easy to regard the first person singular as some kind of narrow, navel-gazing option that women exercise. I remember when the British poet Vicky Fever talked about writing a menstruation poem. I remember her saying that a critic at that time told her, you know, sort of in a world-weary fashion, oh my God, not another menstruation poem. And the immediate assumption, of course, was that a menstruation poem is a small theme. Never mind that it happens to half the planet. But on the other hand, choosing to write a war poem would not be regarded as a small theme at all. Never mind that it's been written by Homer and Vyasa, and everyone's been talking about war for as long as we can remember. That is never considered a theme that's passé, been there, done that, whereas menstruation is. So these are just the many, many small ways in which I think one finds that one still has to carve out a space for certain kinds of content. And I just want to say the last thing, because I don't want to take up too much space, and I know we should return for more rounds. I just want to say that this idea that there are big themes and little themes in literature, in poetry, is something that I really do believe we need to resist in some way. Far too often, we consider certain themes small and narrow, and menstruation being an example. And so when you write about it, you're regarded as, in fact, a limited writer. But the moment you choose to write about something else that may be outside the ken of your immediate experience, you're immediately regarded as inauthentic or transgressive. And this is something that I think women, many women writers I've known, have had to deal with time and again.
Thank you. Katharina, your present exhibition that you have here alludes to two very crucial issues in the title itself. One, you talk about the Lakshman Rekha, and two, you talk about crossing the Lakshman Rekha. I think both of these issues are incredibly topical in any case in the recent past, but they have been historically as well. You, as a German settled in India, choosing the title of Crossing the Lakshman Rekha, please tell us about this in the context of your art and your place here.
My journey has been less smooth than yours. I find it very difficult as a woman to gain that self-confidence that men so often project. It was a long journey to come to that point. You call it crossing the Lakshmana Rekha. I felt for so many years that my Lakshmana Rekha has been crossed in constantly by trivialization, as you mentioned it. I have heard things like people asking me, how are you going with your hobby? I wonder if a man who reinvented himself, I'm just in my art for 5 years, and just now that I'm saying just already shows the way I'm kind of, as a woman, always look at the humble side instead of, I'm a great artist after 5 years. So this kind of being being made small, it does something to you. It leaves a mark, and it's, for me, it has been very, very difficult, and the process is not over at all, to come out of that space and to claim that entitlement of, yes, I can, and set the boundaries of not kind of crossing into my space by often unintentionally humiliating. To give you another example, as Amita was mentioning, I'm also a writer. I happen to be married to a writer. As a woman, you hear, oh, are you typing your husband's manuscripts? These are real things that happened. And it is often that I've been asked, oh, how, is your husband your first reader? Of course he is. So am I his first reader. So there are constant kind of assumptions being made, and I don't blame people for it either, because all of us are so much growing up in stereotypes. We have there's so much internalized that we often don't even realize how we are responding to a female in our own kind of entitlement, and to a male. So for me, I felt it was a stony way, and to just stand up and stand tall for myself as a woman, as an artist, and cut out the woman in front, as an artist, as a writer, not kind of in that special space. Now working on themes like womanhood, I wish and I hope, and I see it also more, that men do the same thing, that men come up and address these issues and work in arts, write books, poetry about it, so that this kind of titling of woman art or woman issues falls away. This is also why I dislike, in a way, though it happens very often, women groups. Why is it that we need to have that special kind of title of women? So it is still a long road to go, but I think to kind of constantly reflect on that and also respond to these things that kind of come our way is also making us very strong. So I've gained strength to it, to be not fearful, to whatever I do and I think is right to do, I just do it.
Has it been a different when you were in Germany? Is it how is it? To create that space here versus creating that space in Germany, how would you negotiate that?
No, not really. I think it's really a universal theme which has cultural imprints. So some of the issues are different here than they are in Germany. But to give you an example, the glass ceiling in Germany is much stronger than in India. If you have a certain education in India as a woman, you're not questioned twice, maybe twice, but not twice as in Germany. So I find that it's as kind of difficult to negotiate that space as it is here, though there are different inroads that are easier in Germany than, let's say, in India, and vice versa. So I think it is an issue that we have to confront everywhere in the world, to stand up as a human being and not kind of being labeled, and that labeling meaning to be made small.
Tishani, we in this edition are also commemorating three legends. MS Subbulakshmi, Chandralekha, Mahashweta Devi. Yesterday when we were watching the film of MS Subbulakshmi, I remember Gauri Ramnarayan mentioning that MS found it queasy and not quite apt that she was called the Nightingale. And I have questioned very often, because when I stand up and introduce artists, there are words for men, ustads and pandits, and till date we do not have a word that shows the prowess and the proficiency of a woman performer, an artist. In that context, you as a writer, journalist and a dancer who has so closely worked with one of the strongest women voices in her times, what is your take on that?
So I just want to say a few things that I want to respond first, because I think is there something about the collective of women that the collective of men don't have? And is that something worth exploring? And I do think there is something. I do think there is something about women sharing their stories, about reading women's stories together. But like you said, I wouldn't want to be restricted to those stories. I mentioned something in my talk earlier where, as a dancer, very much talking about ideas of gender and sexuality, after 15 years of working on one piece, I suddenly had a revelation of primordial gender, that is before gender, you know, an idea of just to be a creature. And I had this idea that I'm on stage and that I'm just discovering that I have limbs. And it was so freeing for me, because for so many years people saw my dance and said, Shiva, Shakti, Purusha, Prakriti, this is what they saw, and there are these images there. But what was empowering for me is to completely just get out of that gender dialogue and say, no, I am beyond gender, and I am a creature, and I have a heart, and I have legs, and I have arms, and I have a brain, and I'm trying to figure myself out. And it was so wonderful to not think of myself as a woman. I don't think I answered your question.
Yeah, that's okay. But if I may ask again, how was your experience with Chandra in this context, where she also, while not creating, well, actually she did create gender specific, I mean her Shakti and Stree, and she did engage herself quite intensely with womanhood on the one hand, and yet quite neutral and beyond, as you said.
Well, I think Chandra was somebody who was not interested in equality. I mean, I think she very clearly put the female principle as primary. I think she didn't think about women wanting to be equal with men. She saw women beyond. She saw women as the ultimate creators. And she always said, you know, I don't want to talk about procreation, I'm talking about creation, all of creation. So she's talking about Shakambari, she's talking about, again, these sort of, images and ideas that precede the kind of conversations we're having about gender now. And trying to draw some kind of strength from that. But definitely she made a battle as a woman. She lived alone, she didn't get married, she didn't have children, she created her own society in a way around her, which was not tied to the idea of family and blood. She was getting rid of that idea, and I thought that was very, very powerful. But again, in her work, I think there's a sense of, you know, the female principle, the idea of the femininity in bodies, whether they are bodies of men or women. These are things that she constantly explored. But also she would admit that, you know, like I had, shared that story about Raga, which was with these two men, when she got so criticized for it being a homoerotic piece because it's two men showing great tenderness in a way that if you saw two women doing it to each other, people would not they would not have that reaction, you know. It would be, they are sort of used to seeing that image, but two men being tender with each other like that was considered really, and they said, what is this homoerotic, where is this coming from? And she always had a very good response, which is, Rorschach. It's like you come to the work with something that's in your head. So if you see obscenity, that's because that's what's in your head. And she said, I worked with the two men because that day at rehearsal, two men showed up. But if two women had showed up, I would have worked the same movements with their bodies. So body is body. And I think it's like coming down to a kind of very basic idea. It's very difficult to do now because I think we live in such politicized time and the body is such a, weapon in so many ways. But I think in a way that she was trying to push beyond that.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's actually the work that we have to do to constantly, go in that fluidity and move out of the categories that are constantly set upon us. From women as well as men. It's not just men. I mean, it's a lot of women who actually are strongly categorizing and pushing us in corners or boxes. So I totally agree, and I find this is a beautiful story. That's a very strong story also, which we always should remember to simply go beyond these boundaries and not even being answerable to these boundaries that are set upon us?
It's a tricky line. It's a very, very tricky one, I think. And I think all of us here would probably agree that everyone wants to be taken seriously because of their work, because of the intrinsic merit of their work. But we cannot be naive, and I think none of us are. We are also aware, as Katharina pointed out, we are also aware that ideas of merit are not untainted. That they are, in fact, it's a very contested idea. What constitutes merit, what constitutes good art, is in itself fashioned by so many biases. So I think to talk about actual examples of work may be the more interesting thing to do, when we were talking about Chandra. Because I think Chandra is certainly an example in the case of dance. My own interest in recent times has also been with the many bhakti women poets that I looked at in my anthology, Eating God. Just to talk about ways in which men and women play with gender and find it in many ways a very liberating exercise. So when some of the male bhakti poets like Annamacharya, for instance, use the female voice, there is another kind of voice that emerges. There is another kind of sensuality and freedom that emerges in that poetic diction. And when they speak as the male seeker, there is something else which has its own validity and its own beauty. Just to be able to see these as fluid categories, but at the same time, not to pretend too easily that we are gender neutral. Because we have all, I think everyone has known moments of transcendence. Everyone has known moments when we were not just a man and not just a woman. And at the same time, we are also aware that there are times when we are, and when it's not such a bad thing, to be woman and man. So to be able to arrive at greater fluidity with those labels, to be able to wear them and know when to take them off, to know how to negotiate spaces within them so that these can become celebratory at times rather than oppressive. I think these are ongoing negotiations. The poems that I love are, and I love to quote at readings, are Soirabai, the 14th century Marathi woman mystic, the Dalit woman mystic. Her poem where she talks again about menstruation. And she says, if menstrual blood makes me impure, show me who was not born of that blood. And she says, Panduranga, you're the one who understands that these notions of purity and impurity do not exist. Or you have, of course, Akka Mahadevi, who's able to say, take these husbands who die and decay and feed them to your kitchen fires. So we are talking about 12th century, 14th century voices around us that just are waiting to be heard again and again, waiting to be reclaimed.
Just to add that I feel we shouldn't lose humor also. I think that's a very powerful tool to also play and express our works. So humor always should be one ingredient that should remain in that debate of gender.
So we heard that gender does not necessarily play a role beyond a particular stage of experience, perhaps, be it in dance or. But does it not? I mean, do you not meet it frequently in the patriarchal establishment where you go to print your books or sell them or go to the people who would possibly be the deciding factor of whether the installations happen or not, or object to certain types of works? I mean, this is a discussion we had. What Katharina has put up are very bold statements of womanhood in her Crossing the Lakshman Rekha, and she has done this before, and these are issues which should evoke certain sentiments, certain dialogue. So that obviously is something that you must be meeting frequently. And how do you deal with that?
I think again there is a slight there is a slight ambivalence for me, because I also accept that I am a dancer and a writer because I'm a woman, but if I were a man and I wanted to be a dancer and a writer, would it be so accepted? Would people, I mean, it's a strange flip, because the reason is that because people don't consider it of any great consequence, so it's fine. I can do it and I can pursue it with great gusto. But if I were a man in India with the expectations that patriarchy places on men, which is that they should be breadwinners and they should do this and they should do that, would I be able to pursue being a poet and a dancer with as much, I guess, in a way, freedom that I have had? It doesn't come easily, but I think also in a way I have thought about it from that end, and I think I don't know what it would be like actually to be a man and trying to pursue an artistic life in a country that expects you to be a provider, and the arts don't always provide, so it's difficult. But in the sense of my own work and having worked through it and trying to find an audience for it, I don't know. I can't. I think that it's very present always, and you kind of have to keep brushing up against it and trying to confront it. But I do think that we live in a greater time of freedom than people before. So I feel in a way that there has been a kind of flourishing, and there has been a kind of elbowing and saying, actually, we need more space, So that is happening now, and I think that we need to have more of that.
I agree on one hand. On the other hand, it is quite tiring to constantly fight that battle. So for me, one way of trying to deal with that is just look at the wider horizon. Just see that as little kind of hurdles on the way, which we cannot change because that's how things are set up. And just kind of look at the horizon, and the horizon means what do I want, where do I want to go to, and just continue that line. So that is the strength that I get out of this shark pool, so to speak, in which we all swim and have to somehow survive. So in a way, I think ignorance is a way of trying to keep one's own energy together to do what is important and not being held up by all these little struggles of most often being secondary line because you're a woman. To just give you an example, I mean, in the art world, there have been studies and statistics on how much space is given for men to exhibit and to women. It's much less. A woman is selling for less money, even though her art might be as kind of prestigious, her name might be as prestigious. If you see women in majority in a museum, then it is on pictures men have painted. So these are problems we are facing constantly, and I don't want to get tired of it and by it. I just want to jump over it and do my work. So I think that's the only solution we have.
In writing and literature as well, there are all these statistics of how many women reviewers there are, how much space is given to women whose books are being reviewed, all the while knowing that women constitute the largest audience of book readers. They read more books than men. And so it would kind of follow by that statistic that there should be, if not at least equal, more space for women. But in fact it's not so. And I think now that there's, been a big sort of hue and cry about it, and people make a sort of conscious, but there's always that element of tokenism. And I think one thing we haven't talked about is ambition. And I think ambition is a very important thing to talk about, because it is always seen as such an inelegant and horrible thing for a woman to be ambitious. But it's sort of, absolutely fine if a man is.
Yes, in fact, what I wanted to talk about was also in relation to that, perhaps the other side of that, which is self-doubt. I think a certain measure of self-doubt, we'd all agree, is wonderfully motivating. It's very good for one's art, it's very good for, it's nice to hang around people who aren't full of themselves, so it also makes for good company. But that apart, the levels of self-doubt, of really corrosive self-doubt, that I know many young women have to deal with and continue to deal with well into their adulthood is something that certainly needs to be addressed. I was just reading in yesterday's papers that young girls, until the age of 6, apparently, when shown pictures, you must have read this, many of you, when shown pictures of other young girls and boys, and when they were asked, who is the genius here, who's the brilliant one, all of them would point to a member of their own gender, until the age of 6. After the age of 6, oddly enough, things start changing, and girls start pointing to the boy. It's always the male who is the genius. So in fact, that's how deep it goes. The idea that even the word genius, never mind whether we call people ustads and pandits, and we can only call women soulful, mellifluous singers. Apart from that, even the notion of genius is something that women themselves haven't internalized. It cannot be it cannot be a self-descriptor, even of others of the same sex. So I think this is how insidious it is and how deep it is. So ambition comes actually later, but I think the self-doubt part of it, when it is this toxic, when it is gnawing at, when the fire that should actually be turning out works of art is actually consuming you to this degree, what can you have but the age-old stereotype that we're all trying to resist of the self-destructive woman artist? We all resist that. We're all trying to, as Katharina says, vault over it to new definitions. But we can't pretend that these issues exist on some level and have to be confronted and then moved around. Then we sidestep them. It's interesting to notice the various ways in which women sidestep, vault over, find their own ways of being themselves in a world that would, in many ways, have us be different.